maybe we
All right, I'm going to match you notebook for notebook right there.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I'm going to run out of hands, but that's all right.
So I was sitting listening to the Life in Other Places and the bottom-up power of Wikimedia, and I wondered whether we ought to talk about how to make life better here, and it made me think about the election that we're in. You among other things, are putting futurism and design together and talk about anticipatory democracy.
Right,
What
yeah,
is
that's a term that Alvin Toffler, I think, coined in the 1970s.
You've been doing such, one of the things we have in common is both of us coming up to the edge of the limits of the scenario methodology invented a while ago, and we've done it in different ways. And I'm very fascinated with these experiments you've been doing. So have you done anything yet in a way that really has come up to the edge of getting people to do things differently?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, well, I have attempted to, yeah. Prior to moving to the Bay Area about a year ago, I lived in Hawaii and worked for the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies, which was set up in 1971 by a gentleman named Jim Data, who still directs it. And the history of the organization is sort of interesting because it was established at the end of a 1.5 year long process called Hawaii 2000 that was run in 1970-71, I think, for about 18 months. And it was the single largest, broadest-based, most participatory exercise in futuring, in foresight, ever held anywhere. So Hawaii 2000, 1970, looking 30 years ahead. And the HRCFS, as I'll call it, was set up at the end of that. Now, the sad kind of coda to this to that process. Oh, and I forgot to mention, Alvin Toffler was brought out, Arthur C. Clarke, the good and the great, futures thinkers of the time were participating in this, and Hawaii had only been a state for 10 years at that point. So it was a very promising kind of early signal that they were interested in institutionalizing a forward view. Now, sadly, what happened was in 1973, there was an oil crisis, and in effect, a lot of that forward thinking was shelved in favor of crisis management. And it never really made its way back into the political process. So by the time the year 2000 came around, what had actually eventuated in Hawaii was one of the worst case scenarios that people had imagined in 1970. So I started there 5 years later, 2005, and at the end of that year, the state government approached us at the Futures Center and said we'd like to have a statewide conversation about the future, deja vu. But this time we want to base the conversation around sustainability, and we'll make the focal point, the time horizon, 2050. And so in 2005, this kind of planning process began, and in 2006, it was kicked off. Now I'm getting to the answer of your question, which was we realized that, involving people in a discussion of the relatively far future, several decades out, is not where most of us spend most of our day, and it's a complex and difficult thing to get people who have urgent issues. They have kids to feed, they have jobs to do, they have meetings to make it to, and the multi-decadal timeline future is not generally on the table. So we had to find a way to make it compelling, make it concrete, make it present to people. And so I think the experiments, or one of them that you're referring to, was an attempt by myself and Jake Dunnigan, who's now at Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, to stage what we called experiential scenarios. So a series of immersive experiences that evoked, or that sort of attempted to role play, in essence, 4 different versions of the year 2050 that people could spend time in, and then discuss their future, their priorities, their expectations on the basis of a far more visceral and bodily and lived sense of the variety of futures on offer. So, and I'd say that is sort of trying to push things
but you also kind of
what's possible.
there was a prankster quality to some of it too. So which of it worked the best?
Well, the prankster, I like the history of the word. Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, and
I think there's one in the room.
Yeah, right. But yeah, the connotations can be difficult too. Basically, that process, the 2050 one, in some ways failed to be institutionalized effectively as well. I mean, a sustainability plan was produced. You can find it online, but there's nothing particularly compelling about it. And as far as I know, life in Hawaii has not been revolutionized. It's nice to see that it has come, some distance in terms of environmental awareness, some of the basic things like recycling programs and things. But basically, the process wasn't, although the intervention that we held for 2050 was a great success compared to your standard workshop process, the larger agenda of which it was a part was not an overwhelming success, unfortunately. And so it was with some reluctance that Jake and I turned to, reluctance but excitement actually, because there was a lot of interesting potential there, that we turned to bringing futures into people's everyday lives, whether they had asked for them or not. So we would send them postcards from alternative versions of the year 2036, there was a project we conducted in Chinatown, Honolulu, where posters and various artifacts from alternative versions of Chinatown in the future were sort of plastered in the streets for people to stumble across during their lunch hour. Which was more successful? I think there are pros and cons to both the kind of contained setting of a workshop, a known participant base, all that kind of thing, compared to trying to address people directly in the middle of their, in the middle of their day when they haven't asked for it. But I think the latter is needed because not enough people are opting into the former and to having conversations about futures, for all the urgent reasons that I referred to before.
One of the things that I feel, I first went to work at GBN with Peter and Stuart in '95. And I think that was about the same time Long Now was getting going.
Right.
And I think in the attention span and the way in which things have sped up has gotten a lot worse in that period of time. So I mean, the inspiring sense of, if you can get people to think about the long term, you have a better chance of getting to do the right thing, which was part of the purpose that got me to go to GBN in the first place. I just think that's getting harder and harder and harder to do, instead of, despite all the wonderful things that have been done and are happening. And I really do wonder what, and I think of it, in terms of our politics. So we think about, democracy not in the Wikimedia case, but in what we are in this, it's like, how do we get people to engage in something larger rather than shorter term and more narrow? It just seems like it's getting harder and harder, and that's why I was just really interested in some of the experiments that you were doing. I mean, for me with scenarios, the thing that I kept running into was the point at which the scenarios met the human system that had to act on them. And often the great breakdown between, no matter what perceptions or ideas people had come, just sort of the sheer reality
You're talking
of
about the implementation of insights gleaned through the scenario process.
And of course the people who started working on that at Shell knew that from the beginning. But
right.
But it's what I've spent much of the last years doing is trying to move into systems where the issues of what I would think of as the human and organizational and financial sustainability,
right.
Questions of how you get institutions and human communities to hold the long term. What does that look like? And I think that's one of the other really interesting experiments about Long Now, not just how do we build this clock that's going to last, but how do you build an organization that could
right.
maintain it, and all the rest.
Right.
I'm interested. I have a lot of questions about that. I'm not sure I have any answers, but I'm curious about what you think.
I mean, it seems to me that one of the it makes a lot of difference. I've noticed based, it makes a lot of difference to how people understand what they think you're doing, based on whether you introduce yourself as being a futurist, a futures person, or risk management person. I don't think of my work in those terms, but that is much easier for people to understand. Strategic management, no problem. That's serious work.
Prankster.
Well. Right, yeah, well, there's that too. And foresight is actually more readily understood by people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of those terms as almost interchangeable. Foresight being the capacity, and futures, alternative futures, being the subject matter, which the foresight is kind of exercised on, if you like. But if you talk about your work as being futures work or being a futurist, it seems to import boatloads of connotations and assumptions which are largely unhelpful to actually getting people to think about the future and to think of things in terms of alternatives. And so it's become clear to me that it's important to recognize that this perspective, the longer term and the multiple scenario perspective that one has to offer, needs to be seen as part of an array of tools that people bring to whatever task it is that they're doing. If you allow yourself to be typecast as the person who is always and only constantly advocating, the 10,000-year view, then there's going to be a massive disconnect. But what's actually called for is is more of a long zoom type of idea where you can see things in the present for what they are or what they appear to be, and then to sort of assume the perspective of the longer term in addition to that, and to be able to alternate between how things look from here and how things look 10, 20, 50, however many is appropriate years out, but not to kind of not to be understood as trying to supplant people's current understandings, because that doesn't work.
Yeah, you have to start very much from understanding where they are and why it is that they feel the way they do.
Right. So one thing I was curious about, you said that you found yourself sort of coming up against the limits of scenario thinking and scenarios as a method. Can you say more about what some of those limits are and how you've tried to work around them or use them to your advantage?
So I think the first one I already talked about, that I got more and more interested in the organizations and the human beings, and how it is to help people change and help organizations change, and took my work in that direction even when I was working in the scenario. But I had a very interesting opportunity that I was given to take the methodology that had been developed in business mostly and experiment with it very intensively in nonprofits and philanthropy over a period of years. And it was fascinating. I found that the business people were much better at taking a set of alternative futures and stepping back and saying, well, we could do this in this future, and this in this future, and this in this future over here, because in fact they were doing it for the most part about they could make money, and they could make money in any future, and one was more challenging than the other, but it was. But if you did that same thing with a group of people who've just spent 20 years or 30 years invested in trying to bring a certain future about, you could sometimes literally watch their body language. They just would go in the corner and start doing this. You just couldn't. It was too hard. It was too threatening, because actually some of those futures would fundamentally destroy their life's work, right? And so the fact that you could actually go live in that future and learn something and actually invent a better strategy to bring about the thing that was their life's work, was really, really too hard. And so I began to experiment with and try to understand how to how to work with some of those ideas and tools in different ways, and because I do think that we're in a moment where we have to innovate radically across many things, and so especially for people. I feel it's myself, as you get older, all the things that got you to where you are now are not the things you're going to need to succeed moving ahead. And so part of the job is to take the leader and shake them up enough that without being threatened, or that you can open up and see the things that 10 or 20 years ago might have been unthinkable to you, that might actually be the thing you need to do now.
I think that fear that you refer to is a really interesting piece of this kind of work. And once it's articulated, or once you're able to talk about it, it's a whole different conversation than the fear which prevents the conversation from happening in the first place, and prevents the examination of the future and of, especially the scary ones in which your life's work amounts to nothing, or is destroyed.
Exactly. My favorite thing that I think I've ever read or heard about organizational change was the great organizational theorist Edgar Schein. Sat down with Harvard Business Review after spending decades studying all this, and they said to him, "Okay, what did you learn in 50 years of research?" And he said, "Well, really, it just was one thing, and that is that people in organizations don't change until their fear of survival exceeds their fear of learning. So mostly it's so hard to learn and it's so scary that you have to have this kind of threat." And I feel like actually we just lived through the last 10 years we actually wasted 2 major crises in the world. I will never forgive George Bush for many things, but the thing I will absolutely never forgive him for is that he could have asked us to do anything in this country. Anything.
When you said 2 crises, I thought you meant the first election and the second one, but anyway.
No. 9/11, and then I think Obama failed to ask enough of the moment that he inherited.
Right.
So there is something about that sort of moment of fear, and when your survival is in play. And the problem with so many of these long-term things that we face in this context of time is that we don't experience them in a way that seems to threaten our survival.
No, right. I mean, and that's the point of doing experiential scenarios and bringing it out in people, is that there is a fundamentally emotional component to this kind of work, which has to do with there's this book, Switch, Chip Heath and Dan Heath, where they talk about the rider and the elephant as being, that's their metaphor for the 2 sides of the psychological system, the rational and the emotional, and you have to motivate the elephant as well as persuade the rider in order to move in the desired direction. And so, I think that translating futures work and scenarios into experiences that people can have is a way of bringing these things out. And it might scare the hell out of the elephant to do that, but a hypothetical conversation like that is the safe space where you can go through those things. Rather than waiting for the crisis to happen. One thing that we said, in response to the prankster newspaper coverage of some of the interventions we did in the public, was that it's better to be surprised by a simulation than blindsided by reality, because the simulation can't hurt you. If you wait until the reality, hits you over the head and you move into crisis mode, well, it's a lot easier to defend, because look, there's a crisis. It's really self-evident, but you've already lost the opportunity to actually move proactively towards the future that you want. And also crisis can be abused, as you've just suggested.
I've missed the moment to ask you what your next experiment is, so I guess we're going to have to all find out. It's great to meet you. Thank you.
Likewise.